The dust hung thick as a shroud, tasting of grit and despair, each particle a testament to the parched land and the drier hopes of the men gathered. Heat shimmered above the crude auction block, distorting the grim faces, making them predatory and indistinct. Silas watched from the edge of the sparse crowd, the brim of his hat pulled low, a shadow amongst shadows. His hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of wrestling a living from unforgiving soil, clenched and unclenched at his sides. He hadn't come for this. He'd come for livestock, for tools, for anything that might fill the gaping silence of his ranch, a silence that had grown teeth since the fever took her and the boy. But the husks of families being paraded, sold off like chattel under the guise of indentured service, it was a fresh kind of damnation. Then he saw her. Ilara. Her back was straight, a lonely pillar of defiance in a sea of degradation. 5 young girls, her daughters, clung to her skirts, their faces pale, eyes wide and mirroring the terror she so fiercely suppressed. The auctioneer, a man whose voice oozed false piety, extolled her virtues, strong, hard-working, proven child-bearer, though her last child was clearly past infancy. His words were lashes, each one stripping away another layer of her dignity. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. It wasn't pity, not entirely. It was a bleak recognition, a shared understanding of loss, though hers was unfolding in this horrifying present. He saw the leers of the other men, their speculative glances raking over Ilara and her older daughters, and a slow, cold anger began to burn through his weariness. He thought of his empty cabin, the wind whistling through the ill-fitting door, the meals eaten in solitude, the ghosts of laughter that no longer echoed. This was madness. A desperate, foolish impulse. But the alternative, the return to that crushing emptiness, suddenly felt more unbearable than the scorn of these townsfolk or the burden he was contemplating. The bidding started low, insultingly so. A rancher with a cruel mouth and small eyes made an offer. Then another. Silas remained still, his face unreadable. He waited, letting the price crawl upwards, letting their baser desires expose themselves. When the bid slowed, when the auctioneer seemed ready to bring down his gavel, Silas spoke, his voice raspy from disuse, but clear and carrying in the sudden hush. $50, a collective gasp. It was a significant sum, more than these souls were deemed worth. The cruel-mouthed rancher scowled, then upped his bid. Silas countered without hesitation. The town sheriff, a portly man whose authority rested on a blend of apathy and intimidation, watched with a flicker of interest. This was becoming entertainment. The bidding became a duel between Silas and the rancher, each word a hammer blow. Ilara stood frozen, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the humiliation, beyond the dusty square. Her daughters burrowed closer, sensing the shift in tension. Silas didn't look at them. He looked at the auctioneer, his eyes like chips of flint. Finally, the rancher spat on the ground and backed down, muttering curses. Sold. The auctioneer's voice boomed, feigning triumph. To the quiet man in the back. Silas stepped forward, the dust swirling around his worn boots. He counted out the silver dollars, the coins clinking with a terrible finality onto the auctioneer's table. He didn't meet Ilara's eyes, not yet. He felt the weight of every gaze, the judgment, the whispers. He had bought a family. The words tasted like ash in his mind. He acquired a dilapidated wagon from a liveryman who looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt, the transaction as grim as the first. The journey to his ranch was a long, slow crawl under a merciless sun. Ilara and her daughters huddled in the back of the wagon, a silent, fearful tableau. Silas walked beside the weary horse, the reins loose in his hand, the silence stretching between them, taut and fragile as a spider's thread. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the occasional muffled sob from one of the younger girls, quickly shushed by an older sister. He didn't know what he had done. He only knew the silence in his cabin might now be filled, even if only with the sound of fear. The sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood and bruised purple, before darkness swallowed them whole, leaving only the relentless, unforgiving grit of the trail ahead and the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air, what now? The ranch, when they finally reached it well after dusk, was less a homestead and more a scar upon the land. The cabin sagged, its timbers weathered to a silver gray, the porch threatening to collapse. A broken fence limped around a barren corral. It was a place that mirrored Silas's own soul, stark, worn, and holding onto existence by a thread. Ilara surveyed it in the pale moonlight, her expression unreadable. If she felt despair, she didn't show it. She merely clutched the hand of her youngest, Lily, a little tighter and waited. Silas gestured wordlessly towards the cabin. "It ain't much," he mumbled, the first words he'd spoken directly to her since the auction. He didn't expect a reply, and he didn't get one. He busied himself unhitching the horse, his movements stiff and awkward. Inside, the cabin was a single room, dominated by a cold hearth and sparse, rough-hewn furniture. A cot in one corner, a table, 2 chairs. Dust lay thick on every surface. It smelled of disuse and loneliness. Ilara took it all in with a sweeping glance. Her eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, missed nothing: the threadbare blanket on the cot, the meager stack of firewood, the profound lack of feminine touch. Practicality, born of harsh necessity, took over. She set about finding a broom and a bundle of twigs Silas had bound together, and began to sweep, the rhythmic scrape a small, defiant sound against the oppressive silence. The older girls, Martha and Clara, watched their mother, then, without a word, began to explore the small space, their movements hesitant, like mice in a new, potentially dangerous territory. The 2 middle girls, twins named Sarah and Eliza, huddled together, while Lily, no more than 5, stayed glued to Ilara's side, her thumb firmly in her mouth, her wide eyes fixed on Silas. He felt like an intruder in his own home. He gestured towards a sack of flour and some dried beans in a corner. "There's food." He didn't know how to act, what to say. He was a man of the land, of solitary work, not of families and frightened children. He retreated to the porch, leaving them to the dim interior, and stared out at the dark, indifferent landscape. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. He hadn't thought this through, driven only by that raw, nameless ache. Now, the reality of 5 young faces, of a woman whose pride he had irrevocably damaged, settled upon him. He heard faint movements from inside, the murmur of Ilara's voice, low and soothing, as she directed her daughters. After a while, a faint light flickered from the cabin's single dirty window. She had found the oil lamp and managed to light it. The smell of wood smoke soon followed. She was attempting to start a fire in the hearth. He should help, he knew, but he felt rooted to the spot, a stranger at his own gate. Later, Ilara emerged, a silhouette against the faint light from the doorway. "The children need to sleep," she stated, not a request, but a fact. He nodded, then realized she couldn't see him properly in the dark. "I'll take the barn," he said, his voice rough. It was a poor excuse for a barn, more of a lean-to, but it would offer some shelter. He didn't wait for her reply, just turned and walked towards it, the weariness of the journey and the heavier burden of his actions settling deep into his bones. As he lay on a pile of old hay, the scent of dust and dry rot filling his nostrils, he heard a small sound from the cabin. A child crying softly. Then Ilara's voice, a lullaby so faint it was almost carried away by the night wind, a melody of sorrow and resilience. He closed his eyes, the tune a haunting reminder of all he had lost, and all he had just so recklessly acquired. He found no sleep, only the cold comfort of the stars above, distant and uncaring. In a dusty crate near his cot, untouched for years, lay a small, carved wooden bluebird, its paint faded. He hadn't looked at it since Martha died. He wondered if Ilara, in her cleaning, would find it. He wondered if she'd understand its silent story, or if it would just be another piece of a broken man's past. Days bled into a routine of shared silence and unspoken tensions. Silas rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime, and worked his barren land, mending fences that seemed determined to fall, clearing stubborn rocks from fields that had yielded little but disappointment. He'd leave a portion of whatever meager food he had, salt pork, beans, coffee, on the rough table before heading out, never waiting to see if they ate it. Ilara, with a quiet, fierce efficiency, took charge of the cabin. It slowly transformed under her hands. The dust vanished, replaced by a cleanliness that was almost painful in its starkness. She found old flour sacks and, with a needle and thread Silas hadn't known he possessed, began to fashion curtains for the window, a small patch of color in the monochrome existence. The daughters, after their initial fear, began to thaw, though Martha, the eldest, remained watchful, her eyes following Silas with a suspicion that pricked at his conscience. Clara helped her mother, her movements mirroring Ilara's competence. The twins, Sarah and Eliza, found a patch of dirt by the cabin door and started a game with pebbles, their hushed giggles the first truly childish sounds to grace the ranch in years. Lily, the youngest, was a small shadow, often found watching Silas from a distance as he worked, her expression solemn, her thumb never far from her lips. He'd feel her gaze on his back, a silent accusation or perhaps just childish curiosity. He never acknowledged it directly, pretending not to notice, but her presence was a constant, subtle pressure. One afternoon, a coyote, emboldened by the scent of humans after a long absence, ventured too close to the cabin, its eerie howl splitting the afternoon stillness. Silas was mending a harness near the lean-to. He saw the flash of movement, the fear on the faces of the twins who were playing outside. Without a word, he picked up the old rifle he always kept close, aimed, and fired. The shot echoed across the plains, sharp and definitive. The coyote yelped once and fell. He reloaded, his movements economical, then walked over to the fallen animal. Ilara appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. Martha and Clara were behind her. He dragged the coyote away from the cabin, towards the bluffs. No words were exchanged when he returned, but the air felt different, a slight easing of the suffocating tension. He had protected them. It was a primal, instinctual act, devoid of any sentiment he could name, yet it shifted something between them. Later that week, Ilara, while sweeping out a particularly dusty corner of the cabin, found it, the small, carved wooden bluebird, nestled on a high, forgotten shelf. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the faded paint, the smooth, worn wood. It was clearly old, made with care, perhaps love. She held it for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. When Silas returned that evening, he noticed the bird was gone from its shelf. He scanned the room, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. Then he saw it. It sat on the small, rickety table, next to a hesitant arrangement of wildflowers in a chipped cup. He looked at Ilara. Her face was turned towards the hearth, where she was stirring a pot of something that smelled surprisingly like a decent stew. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't meet his gaze. But the bird was there. A silent question, perhaps. Or maybe, just maybe, a silent acknowledgement of a shared humanity, a recognition that he, too, had a past, a history that wasn't solely defined by the harsh present. The landscape remained unforgiving, the sun beating down with relentless ferocity, but inside the small cabin, a fragile seed of something unnameable had been inadvertently planted by the discovery of a forgotten toy. The rhythm of their days settled into a strange kind of predictability. Silas worked the land from sunup to sundown, his solitary figure a fixture against the vast, empty horizon. Ilara and the older girls managed the cabin and its immediate surroundings, their labor creating a small pocket of order in the wilderness. They scrubbed, mended, and, with seeds Ilara had carefully hoarded, started a tiny, hopeful garden near the well. Food was still scarce, shared with a solemnity that underscored its preciousness, but no one went truly hungry. The silence remained, but it was less a wall and more a wary truce. Silas found himself observing Ilara more often than he intended. He saw the set of her jaw as she confronted a leaking roof, the tenderness in her hands as she braided Lily's hair, the fierce, protective glint in her eyes when a traveling peddler, a rare visitor, lingered too long with his gaze on Martha. He saw her strength, not the brittle kind that shatters, but the deep, resilient kind that bends and endures. He began to leave small things for the children, a strangely shaped stone he'd found, a handful of wild berries, once even a strip of jerky he'd been saving for himself. He'd leave them where Lily might find them, never handing them over directly, never seeking thanks. Lily, in turn, sometimes left him a wilted wildflower by his usual spot on the porch, or a perfectly round pebble. One sweltering afternoon, the main support beam for the small lean-to where he kept his tools and slept began to groan ominously. It needed replacing, a task too heavy for one man. He stood looking at it, frustration etched on his face. Ilara came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She assessed the situation with a quick, practical glance. "Martha, Clara," she called. The two older girls appeared. "We can brace it," Ilara said, not to him, but as a general statement. For the next hour, they worked together. Silas, Ilara, and her two eldest daughters. He gave curt instructions, they followed, their movements surprisingly coordinated. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary talk, just the grunt of effort, the scrape of wood, the shared focus on the task. When the new beam was finally in place, sweat slicked their faces, dust coated their clothes. Silas looked at Ilara, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. She met his gaze, her own unwavering, before turning back to the cabin. The sheriff, a man named Brody, rode out a few days later, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust that announced his arrival long before he was visible. He was ostensibly checking on Silas, but his eyes lingered on Ilara and the girls, a mixture of suspicion and a veiled, unpleasant interest in his gaze. "Heard you acquired yourself a ready-made family, Silas," Brody said, his tone laced with insinuation. Town's talking Silas stood impassive, his hand resting near the axe propped against the cabin wall. "They got shelter. They work for their keep, that all they do." Brody's smirk was greasy. Ilara, who had been washing clothes near the well, straightened, her eyes cold. "We are indebted to Mr. Thorne for his protection," she said, her voice clear and carrying, devoid of any tremor. Nothing more. Brody's eyes narrowed, but he seemed to sense he'd pushed enough for one day. "Just marking sure everything's proper," he grunted, before turning his horse and riding off, leaving a pall of unease behind him. That evening, as Silas sat on the porch, watching the sky turn a bruised purple, Martha approached him. She stood before him, small but resolute. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice tight, accusatory. "From our mother." Silas looked at her, at the fear and defiance warring in her young face. He thought of his own Martha, of the dreams he'd had for his son. He looked away, towards the dying light. "A roof," he said, his voice low. "Food. Safety." It was a stark, insufficient answer, yet it was the only truth he had to offer. Martha stared at him, searching his face, then turned and went back inside, leaving him with the vast silence of the prairie and the even vaster silence within himself. Martha's question lingered in the dry air, unspoken but palpable. Silas's plain answer, a roof. Food. Safety, had been met not with relief, but with a deeper uncertainty in the girl's eyes. It was too simple, too devoid of the expected human complexities of want or malice. Ilara, though she said nothing, seemed to absorb her daughter's disquiet, her own watchfulness over Silas taking on a new, more nuanced edge. She saw not a captor, but perhaps a man as trapped by circumstance as they were, albeit a circumstance of his own making. Then the sky turned. The relentless, brassy sun of late summer was swallowed by a bruised, churning mass of clouds that rolled in from the west, heavy and pregnant with menace. The wind picked up, howling like a banshee, whipping dust into stinging vortexes. A storm was coming, one of the prairie's sudden, violent furies. Silas knew the signs. "Get inside," he yelled over the rising wind, his voice strained. "Bring in anything loose." He worked with a desperate urgency, securing the shutters, reinforcing the lean-to door where he slept, checking the hastily constructed animal pen that housed their single, bony cow and a few chickens Ilara had managed to trade for with a passing tinker. Ilara and the older girls moved quickly, gathering stray tools, securing the water barrel, their faces grim. Lily, terrified by the shrieking wind and the darkening sky, clung to Ilara's legs, whimpering. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the dry earth, quickly escalating into a torrential downpour. Lightning split the sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small cabin. Inside, it was near dark, the single lamp casting flickering, elongated shadows. The wind battered the cabin, rattling the door in its frame, finding every crack to whistle through with mournful fury. Silas stayed outside as long as he dared, ensuring the runoff wasn't undermining the cabin's already precarious footings. He was soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead, the cold seeping into his marrow. When a particularly violent gust nearly tore a shutter from its hinges, he finally retreated inside, dripping a puddle onto the swept floor. The 6 of them were huddled together, away from the door and window. Ilara held Lily, murmuring reassurances, while the older girls watched the storm's fury with wide, frightened eyes. The noise was incredible, a constant roar punctuated by the crackle of lightning and the boom of thunder. Sometime during the worst of it, a loud crack echoed from outside, distinct from the thunder. Silas tensed. The old cottonwood by the creek, he muttered, more to himself than anyone. It was close. Too close. He peered through a crack in the shutters. In the brief, stark illumination of a lightning flash, he saw it, the massive tree had split, half of it crashing down towards the small, struggling garden Ilara had so painstakingly cultivated. A cry escaped Ilara. Not of fear, but of despair. That garden was more than just potential food, it was a symbol of her resilience, her attempt to carve out a sliver of normalcy. Through the night, the storm raged. Silas found himself talking, not much, but more than he had in days. He told them about other storms he'd weathered, about the treachery of the prairie elements. His voice, low and steady, seemed to offer a small anchor in the chaos. He saw Ilara listening, her fear for her children momentarily overshadowed by a shared experience of battling the indifferent cruelty of nature. He even found himself whittling. He always carried a small knife and a piece of scrap wood. His hands, needing occupation, began to shape the wood, slowly, almost unconsciously, into a rough animal figure. Lily watched him, her fear momentarily forgotten, her eyes following the movement of his knife. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean but battered. The air was cool and fresh. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. The garden was partially crushed. The lean-to roof had a hole in it. But the cabin stood. They had weathered it. As Silas stepped out to survey the damage, Ilara followed. They stood side by side, looking at the fallen cottonwood. It missed the well, Silas observed, his voice flat. A small mercy. Ilara nodded, her gaze fixed on the ruined patch of green. Then, she looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't fear, or suspicion, or even grudging respect. It was something softer, more complex. A shared weariness, perhaps. A shared survival. Lily, holding the small, roughly carved wooden horse Silas had finished during the night, came to stand beside her mother, looking from the fallen tree to Silas, her small face serious. The immediate threat had passed, but the storm had stripped away more than just branches and leaves, it had eroded some of the barriers between them, leaving them exposed, vulnerable, and irrevocably changed. The days that followed the great storm settled into a new, quieter rhythm. The oppressive heat had broken, replaced by a crystalline autumn air that carried the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The shared ordeal of the storm had subtly altered the atmosphere within the small cabin and the equally small family unit it housed. There was still a profound caution, a reticence born of past traumas and present uncertainties, but the raw edge of fear, particularly directed at Silas, had softened. He worked tirelessly to repair the storm's damage, his movements economical and purposeful. Ilara, with Martha and Clara, salvaged what they could from the garden, their faces set with a grim determination that spoke volumes of their spirit. He found himself leaving slightly larger portions of food for them, a piece of dried apple for Lily tucked beside her tin cup, a task he performed with a studied casualness that fooled no one, least of all Ilara. She, in turn, began to leave a cup of hot, albeit weak, coffee on the porch railing for him in the mornings, a silent acknowledgement of his labors. She mended a tear in his worn canvas jacket without comment, leaving it folded neatly on his cot in the lean-to, which he'd patched with salvaged timber. These were small gestures, almost imperceptible, yet they built a fragile bridge across the chasm of their initial transaction. Silas felt a slow thawing within him, a painful cracking of the ice that had encased his heart for so long. The presence of the children, their subdued chatter, even their occasional squabbles, were sounds he hadn't realized he'd missed so profoundly. He still mourned Martha and his boy, a constant ache deep within, but the raw agony was now overlaid with a new, hesitant layer of something else. He dared not name it hope. Ilara, too, found herself observing Silas with a different lens. She saw the weariness in the lines etched around his eyes, the deep loneliness that clung to him like the prairie dust. She recognized a fellow survivor, a soul marked by loss, albeit one whose actions had initially placed him as her captor. The shame of how she had come to be under his roof still burned, a dull ember, but the immediate fear of him, of his intentions, had largely dissipated, replaced by a complex understanding. He was a hard man, yes, a quiet man, certainly, but not a cruel one. He had offered them sanctuary, however rough, and protection, however gruffly delivered. The landscape itself seemed to reflect this subtle shift. Wild asters, purple and gold, bloomed along the creek bed, a defiant splash of color against the muted tones of the prairie. The air was clearer, the vast sky seeming less oppressive, more expansive. One cool afternoon, Silas was sitting on the porch steps, mending a piece of tack, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft. Lily, who had grown bolder in her approaches, was playing nearby with the small wooden horse he had carved during the storm. She had a collection of smooth pebbles and twigs, arranging them into miniature corrals and fences around the toy. She hummed a tuneless little song to herself, a sound that barely disturbed the quiet. Silas worked on, aware of her presence, a faint warmth spreading through his chest at her innocent contentment. He finished his task and set the mended bridle aside. He picked up a stray piece of leather, soft and pliable, and without thinking, began to fashion it into a tiny, rudimentary saddle for her wooden horse. Lily watched, her eyes wide with fascination. He didn't look at her, just concentrated on the small task, his large hands working with surprising gentleness. When he was done, he held it out to her, still not meeting her eyes. "For your horse," he mumbled. She took it, her small fingers tracing the stitching he'd made with a sharpened awl. She carefully placed it on the wooden horse, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then, she looked up at him. Her gaze was direct, solemn, her blue eyes, so like her mother's, yet filled with an innocent clarity that could pierce through the thickest armor. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. And then, she spoke, her voice small but clear, a single word that shattered the careful equilibrium he had so painstakingly tried to maintain. "Pa!" Silas froze. The small awl slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the wooden porch. The world seemed to stop. The wind died. The chirping of crickets ceased. He couldn't breathe. "Pa!" The word, a ghost from a life he thought buried, echoed in the vast emptiness of his soul, cracking open wounds he thought had scarred over. A torrent of emotion, shock, a pain so profound it was physical, and a terrifying, overwhelming surge of something akin to joy, so potent it frightened him, washed over him. He stared at Lily, at her innocent, expectant face. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. Ilara, who had been hanging washing on a line stretched between two posts, must have overheard. She turned slowly, the wet shirt in her hands forgotten. Her face was a mask of conflicting emotions, surprise, a flicker of something that might have been pain or protectiveness, then a slow dawning of understanding. Her eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, met Silas's across the small yard. The single, childish word hung in the cool autumn air, heavy with unspoken meaning, with the weight of their shared pasts and the terrifying uncertainty of their future. It was not an ending. It was a precipice. The silence that followed was no longer born of fear or awkwardness, but of a profound, earth-shattering shift, pregnant with the fragile, terrifying possibility of a new beginning.